Conference 2021, Session 3B, the texts, contexts, and paratexts of English drama. Second, I wanted to acknowledge that I live and work on the traditional territories of the Haudenosaunee, Anishinaabe, and Neutral or Attawandaron peoples, and that the University of Waterloo and my home in Waterloo are situated on the Haldimand Tract, which is land that was promised to Six Nations 10 kilometers on either side of the Grand River from the source to the mouth, and not delivered to them. This is important to me because of who we all are and who we want to be. And I think a land acknowledgement does orient us to the foundation of our work, which is to bring truth to the world, especially the hard truths. Now I would like to introduce our speakers, and then we will have all of three of them speak and have questions and discussions at the end. Laura Estill is Canada Research Chair in Digital Humanities and Associate Professor of English at St. Francis Xavier University in Nova Scotia, Canada. Her monograph, Dramatic Extracts in 17th Century English Manuscripts, Watching, Reading, Changing Plays, and co-edited collections, Early Modern Studies After the Digital Turn and Early British Drama in Manuscript, speak to her interests in both the scribal and the digital reception of early modern drama. Her most recent articles and chapters have appeared in journals such as 17th Century, Shakespeare's Theatrical Documents, and the handbook, the Arden Research Handbook of Shakespeare and Textual Studies. She is co-editor of Early Modern Digital Review and editor of DX, a database of dramatic extracts. Laura's paper today is called Frames Without Pictures, Shirley's Prologues and Epilogues in Poems, etc. from 1646.
Thanks, Kathy, for those wonderful introductions. And thanks also to Ken Graham and everyone else who has worked so hard to put together our conference today, especially given it being online and a bit of an unusual format for a lot of us. I'd like to begin by acknowledging that I'm speaking to you today from the Mi'kma'ki, which is the unceded ancestral territory of the Mi'kmaq people, which covers lots of Nova Scotia and Eastern Canada. In 1946, when the London theatres were closed, James Shirley published a collection titled Poems, etc. Shirley's etc. included prologues and epilogues written to several plays presented in this kingdom and elsewhere. In this presentation, I will be considering how Poems, etc. presents Shirley's works and how it might have been received by early readers. Shirley positions himself as a great poet-playwright who deserved to be poet laureate with this collection. Shirley's dramatic paratexts in Poems, etc. show how the genre of poem, song, paratext, and play often overlapped. Shirley's prologues, many written for plays by other playwrights, are interesting precisely because they challenge our categories of genre and paratext. As Brian Schneider acknowledges, early modern prologues and epilogues raise problems regarding definition, authorship, performance, purpose, and effect. They resist categorization, he says. In Poems, etc., Shirley's prologues and epilogues are not paratextual. They are the text itself. Their publication signals their importance as standalone pieces. Their contribution to the genre of prologue and epilogue, and their value as part of Shirley's oeuvre and his status as poet-playwright. When Ben Jonson died in 1637, Shirley was a strong contender for the laureateship, but the position went to William Davenant in 1638. With Poems, etc., which, as you can see, was published in 1646, Shirley, to use the term Richard Helgerson applied to Jonson, crowned himself laureate. Later 17th century sources attest how close Shirley came to official laureateship. In his 1651 epigram to the most excellent poet, Sir William Davenant, Sam Shepherd wrote, "Jonson is dead, let Shirley stoop to fate, and thou alone art poet laureate." Again, that one's addressed to Davenant. For Marvin Murillo, Shepard's verse is evident that Shirley was the last candidate to be eliminated for consideration for laureateship. Gerard Langbane's biographical sketch from the later 17th century attests how close Shirley came to the official laureateship. In his first sentence, he writes that Shirley was, if not poet laureate yet, servant to Her Majesty. Shirley's career, both during his life and posthumously, was marked by this closeness, but never achieving the official role of poet laureate. Many of the prologues in poems, etc., and epilogues were written around the time that Shirley was being actively considered for this position, and right after he was passed over for it. From 1636 to 1640, Shirley was the lead playwright for the Werburgh Street Theatre in Dublin, which was founded by his friend Sir John Ogilvy. Although this volume is titled Poems, it positions Shirley as a laureate based on his poems and his status as a playwright, which are, as we will see, inextricably linked to his poems. With the frontispiece of Poems, etc., Shirley is crowned with laurels. He's not wearing the laurel crown, but he's literally surrounded by the wreath of laurels. Now, as you know, frontispieces with poets and laurels were so ubiquitous that Humphrey Moseley once commented on the choice to not put laurels on a volume of George Cartwright's plays. In the first commendatory poem in Poems, etc., however, Thomas Stanley suggests the traditional encomiastic trope of calling for a laurel crown for Shirley is inadequate, rhapsodizing. Each line deserves a laurel, and thy praise asks not a garland, but a grove of bays. As a side note, it was only when I was undertaking the research for this paper, and I'm a little embarrassed to acknowledge it, I didn't know that laurels were the same as bay leaves until I wrote this. Anyway, now every time you're cooking pasta sauce, you can think of poetry. The frontispiece visually represents these abundant laurels, if not quite a whole grove, and also Shirley flanked by the tragic muse and the comic muse, which highlights even further the nature of the dramatic text within this volume, even though it's called Poems. Tragedy bearing a sword and crown, comedy sporting a jaunty hat and bared leg, literally supports Shirley. You can see right there, she's lifting him up. His laureateship is tied to tragedy, comedy, drama. Appropriately, this frontispiece, which was engraved by William Marshall, was later used for the publication of Shirley's 6 new plays. In this frontispiece, Shirley is a playwright. The prologues and epilogues are central to this volume, both physically and metaphorically, to the construction of the book and to the construction of Shirley as author. So there's usually 3 sections in this book, and they are 3 bibliographically separate sections. They each have different signature numbers. They're usually bound in this order, and not all copies are complete. But when they are complete, this is how they're bound. The poems in the first section include different kinds of dramatic material, as I will cover. The second section is almost half devoted to prologues and epilogues, as well as this longer epic poem called Narcissus. And the third section, The Triumph of Beauty, is an entire masque. The volume is overwhelmingly dramatic. So I'm going to start with this first section. And talk about how the contents in this are actually dramatic paratexts similar to the prologues and epilogues we find in the second section. For instance, there are poems that were first published with plays, like A Letter to the Lady D.S. Sent with a New Comedy, which was first published with Shirley's The Changes. There's also a letter called To Mr. Philip Massenger on His Renegado, published in 1630 with Massenger's play. One poem in this section, To the Never Enough Honored E of St, the Earl of Strafford, at New Year's Day at night after the entertainment, is actually an epilogue to that was composed for a Dublin performance of The Royal Master, which is one of Shirley's plays, and that was published in the play's first edition. Along with the epilogue to The Royal Master, these poems that were published with plays, other notable dramatic contents from this first section include, as Philip West describes, dramatic lyrics, songs originally composed for and performed within his drama. This section includes songs from The Changes, The Example, and Hyde Park, all of which were published before Poems, etc., as well as The Cardinal and The Imposture, which were published after. Shirley's poetry and drama can hardly be separated, as the poetry comprising the first section of Poems, etc. makes clear. On the second part of Poems, etc., we see there's Narcissus, which is the one epic poem, and then we have prologues. Within the prologue section, there is an added signature, signature D. And in signature D, which was, it's been argued, the last part added to the entire volume in the Pforzheimer catalog, this is the claim, and I believe it. And in this signature, there are prologues that highlight Shirley's ownership of the plays. So here I've bolded to his own comedy there called Rosania or Love's Victory, a prologue to his play called The Brothers, prologue to his tragedy. This last minute addition was likely by Shirley because we have much evidence of the fact that he was one of those playwrights who saw his plays through to publication and was active in the print shop and had relationships with specific printers who printed his works, including Humphrey Moseley. And so the fact that he was possibly the person who asked for this signature to be added, increasing the dramatic material by 25%, and emphasizing his ownership of the plays, signals that the importance of plays to this volume can't be understated. The final prologue in Poems, etc., is the only text in this collection marked with commonplace markers, those marks designed to emphasize ideas to be taken from the text. Titled Prologue to His Tragedy Called The Cardinal, this prologue was never actually published with The Cardinal, but later published with his play called The Sisters in 1642. And then, sorry, it was probably performed with The Cardinal in 1642, and then later published with The Sisters in 1652. This is something that happens with prologues and epilogues, as Brian Schneider has traced, and as you might see, they don't have to always be specific to the play. But this one is published here in Poems, etc., and it's the one that differs most from its other published version. So I went and I looked at all of the prologues and epilogues in this book. I went and I looked at them in all of their other copies that we know of in print and manuscript, and this one has 8 lines missing. Despite these changes, the commonplace markers, so you can see the little, they look like quotation marks, and the lines are italicized. They're doubly marked with gnomic pointing. Are not actually commonplaces as such. They're not proverbial, they're not sententious. Rather, in this case, the commonplace markers are meant for emphasis, to point the takeaways, what should be remembered and what should be copied from this prologue. And the italicized text highlights Shirley's description of earlier playwrights' glory. Shakespeare made even sorrow smile. Fletcher was the muse's darling. Art did bow to Johnson's name. Shirley even positions Fletcher as a worthy laureate forebear, upon whose head the laurel grew and whose wit was the time's wonder. After highlighting their glory, doubly marked out typographically, Shirley laments that their audience has forsaken these early playwrights, declaring, "We must deplore this fate." And then he worries about his own reputation. How must this author fear then? Shirley's final prologue in Poems, etc., positions him in a line of poet playwrights, including Johnson, the actual past poet laureate, and others deserving metaphoric laurels as well. Positioning Shirley in a line of playwrights, including Shakespeare, Johnson, and Fletcher, both affirms his poetic greatness and expresses a nostalgia for an era of bygone theater. Poems, etc. was published after the theaters had been closed for years. In his prefatory poem, Into Poems, etc., Thomas May positions printing as the only solution for playwrights who now deserve applause. Although thou want the theater's applause, which is now fitly silenced by the laws, since these sad times civil swords did rage, it was not fit we should lose such monuments of wit. The press alone can vindicate from dark oblivion thy poems, friend. May goes on to suggest that Shirley's audience will now be those who are literate, that is, reading poems, etc., and not merely ignorant spectators, to use his terms, at the theater. And although theaters were closed, theatrical activities continued, as we've seen in texts from, or as we've seen in studies by B.J. Randall, and we've learned from, for instance, Heidi Craig, how play publication soared in this time period. As Anne Bain Cairo puts it, the combination of print's dominance and the concomitant stage ban finally accelerated theater's alchemical change into dramatic poetry. The idea of poems dramatic for performed interludes dates at least to Putnam's Art of English Poesy, but it is after the theaters closed in 1642 that we see an increase of the term dramatic poetry to describe the publication of previously professionally performed plays. The term continues after the Restoration to be applied to playwrights like Dryden. Poems, etc., while presenting only a single full-text dramatic piece, The Triumph of Beauty, participates in the valorization of play publication by emphasizing the importance of publishing dramatic paratexts, with or without their full plays. Despite not being a playbook, the publication of poems, etc., aligns with interregnum publication habits of plays. So, as Heidi Craig explains, after 1642, there is a marked increase in dramatic paratexts, both in terms of individual volumes with paratexts and the number of paratexts attached to individual volumes. So you see that both things are true. We're getting more plays published, and with each play published, there's more paratexts. And Heidi Craig and Sonia Masai have a new database you can check out, paratexts.folger.edu. It is new and in beta, and go explore that. In their chapter in Shakespeare's Theatrical Documents, Masai and Craig argue that while theaters were closed, there was an unprecedented importance accorded to stage orations in print. Poems, etc., suggest that the motivation for publishing prologues and epilogues went beyond simply glorifying or legitimizing the plays with which they were published. Rather, the prologues and epilogues were valuable in themselves, both as poetry and as stand-ins for the plays they represented. And here's the list of the prologues in the volume, and you can see it's a lot of them. The purpose of published prologues and epilogues vary widely. As Tiffany Stern has demonstrated, they were often intended for a specific moment of performance, such as a first night or a revival. And the dramatic paratexts in poems, etc., are exactly that, commemorations of a particular performance, often Dublin revivals of London plays by plays that were not by Shirley. As Masai and Craig contend, however, in their publication and republication, prologues and epilogues could be radically transformed by their transmission, including with changes to their text and the material that surrounds them. This holds particularly true when prologues and epilogues are printed without their full text, like the full plays that they usually go with. The prologues and epilogues in poems, etc., demonstrate many of the traditional conventions of the genre. They invoke classical muses, they praise the play or the playwright, they ask for the audience's approval. The first one opens with, "I am come to say you must or like the play or forfeit, gentlemen, your wits today." While this text is clearly presented of Shirley's praise of a now unidentified Fletcher play revived in Dublin, the meaning here includes the readerly audience. The reader is invited to like the play as a metonymy for liking theater in general. In this volume, the reader is offered these dramatic paratexts as a way not of admiring Fletcher's play, which is nowhere to be seen, not even mentioned by title, but Shirley's writing. Shirley concludes that short prologue by telling the audience to be or seem wise enough to like the wit. In two cases, the prologues preserved in poems, etc., is the only known evidence that tell us about now lost plays. That includes a play called The Toy and a play called The General. These prologues to lost or unknown plays are paratexts with no text, symbols with no referent, and yet they refer to a larger whole, and they still create meaning when that whole is not there. In poems, etc., the purpose of the prologues is not to introduce a dramatic performance or a printed play text. It's to present Shirley's writing with an emphasis on his dramatic poetry as evidence of his spiritual succession to Johnson's poet laureateship. And if you want to read more about The Toy or The General, you can visit the Lost Plays database at lostplays.folger.edu. In Poems, etc., the prologues and epilogues seek instead to bring a notion into the mind of the reader, not of a specific play, but of drama in general. If these dramatic paratexts are at times aggressively of their moment, there are some very lovely, catty, dramatic moments in here. They're brought together and they create a new moment, one of readership and appreciation of the poet-playwright's oeuvre. They metonymically stand in for Shirley's wide-ranging theatrical career, calling to his published plays, his unpublished plays, and his work revising other playwrights' plays for revivals. Yitka Stolova raises the idea of paratext as an alternative dramatic incarnation, even for paratexts that were never performed, like printers' epistles and commendatory verse. But prologues and epilogues, which were once embodied and spoken, are not just paradramatic, but dramatic in their own right. And as this presentation has demonstrated, the paratexts and the material texts of Poems, etc., including its commendatory verse, the frontispiece, and its arrangement, emphasize the volume's dramatic content as a key part of its value. Shirley's prologues and epilogues are the heart of Poems, etc., which positions his dramatic writing as the centerpiece of his self-crowned laureateship. Thank you.
Thank you, Laura.